Hi there, welcome to what? Series 14, number 29. We're really racking it up, aren't we? And we're going to talk today about Hagar and the birth of her son Ishmael. Now, what happens in this story, it's a bit strange. Sarai gives her servant girl Hagar to Abraham. And as I said, it's a strange story, but really the situation is quite both modern and ancient. Couples who struggle to have children, they often look for alternatives. Adoption, surrogacy, and today IVF and things like that. So the story highlights the stress in those situations, and it mustn't be easy for people. Let's have a look at verses 1 and 2. Sarai proposes a child for Abraham through Hagar. That's the title then. Now Sarai, Abraham's wife, had borne him no children, and she had an Egyptian maidservant whose name was Hagar. So Sarai said to Abram, and see now, the Lord has restrained me from bearing children. Please go into my maid, and perhaps I shall obtain children by her. And Abram heeded the voice of Sarai. Yeah. So we understand that now. Sarah hadn't had kids. Many years before, though, God had promised Abraham that he would have many descendants. That's Genesis chapter 12 and verse 2. To this point, they didn't have kids, particularly not through his wife Sarai. He had, or she had, it says in Scripture, she had an Egyptian maidservant whose name was Hagar. And she was almost certainly part of what Abram had received from his time when he went down to Egypt. Again, that's in Genesis chapter 12. Very likely, Hagar was one of the slaves given to him by Pharaoh when he dismissed him and Sarah. And you know the trouble Hagar brought in the family. If Abram had lived this separated life and had not fallen into the customs of those around him, he would not have had the sin and sorrow concerning Hagar. Now, would he have had that righteous rebuke from Abimelech, which we talked about in chapter 12? It's an interesting concept, isn't it? You see, now the Lord has restrained Sarai from having children. That's interesting because she's saying, God did this. It's God's fault I haven't had kids. Interesting concept, isn't it? Who we blame when things don't go our way. God had promised those descendants, yet it hadn't come after all of those years. There's a lot of pain in those words, though, when you think about it. And a huge amount of pain in the offering of her servant. The pain of hope is deferred in a strange kind of way. The pain of prayers that haven't been answered. Now we own that. The pain of arms that have not held children. The pain of public shame, because back then, if you didn't have kids, it was a shame on you. The pain of blaming God for one's problems and unbelief. It all gets really, really messy. And if we get all that, Sarai's life is full of pain. She comes up with a solution, or so she thinks. She says, please go into my maid. In other words, have sex with my maid. Perhaps I shall obtain children through her. Now, they would have been technically her children because it was her slave. Now, there's a whole convention there that we've got to recognise as well. Sarai encouraged Abraham to take part in what in that day was essentially a surrogate mother arrangement. According to custom, the child would have been considered the child of Abraham and Sarai, not Abram and Hagar. See, Sarai could justify this as a way to fulfill God's promise. Abram, God promised that you would be the father of many nations, and he didn't specifically mention me. Get the concept there? Maybe you're the father of many nations, but I'm not the mother. Okay, it gets tough, doesn't it? Nevertheless, I get the feeling that this was against God's will for a number of reasons. Firstly, it was the sin of unbelief in God and his promise. Sarai believed that God's sovereignty over the womb because she said, hey, look, it's God's fault that I haven't had children. It was a sin against God's plan for marriage, I suppose, as well. That one man and one woman come together in the one flesh relationship. It is a sin against Abraham and Sarai's marriage This surrogacy wasn't done in a doctor's office or anything, but in a bedroom. It's an adulterous situation. And Abram heeded the voice of Sarai. Yeah, now Sarai wasn't the first woman to be tormented by this thought. Maybe my husband would be better off with someone else. It was bad enough for Sarai as it is, and she needed to hold on to that thought that this may be the way that it can work. A godly Christian wife has a lot of wisdom for a husband. On this time, I don't think it was godly. Many husbands learn the value of listening to their wives. Yet no wife is infallible, and Abraham was responsible for his sin as much as she was for suggesting it. Unbelief is based on the advice of his wife. Now, Abram here should have said something like, Sarah, bless your heart, but you're my wife and we're in this together. Difficult as it is, let's believe in God all over again for a miracle. I don't want to sin against God in our marriage with this Egyptian servant girl. Yeah, should have said that. But that's not what happened. That's not what happened. They were in this land for all of this time and they still had no kids. They were promised it, and I dare say they told people in their family that God says this about us. Perhaps this is another way of looking at that old proverb, which is very unbiblical. God helps those who help themselves.